The next two videos will briefly discuss how the psychic apparatus originates from a first hypothetical moment, and how it subsequently organizes in the three systems that were introduced previously, i.e. the id, the ego, and the superego. If we were studying cosmology, these videos would be the explanation of the birth of the universe and its subsequent formation into galaxies. In the Freudian theory of the mind, initially there is neither an ego nor a superego, which is the last psychic structure to form. In these original phases, the psychic apparatus, which is constituted exclusively by the id, can't even process the extremely intense stimuli coming from the external world and from the inside of the organism. We will see in this video that in order for the stimuli to be processed, a primal defense must take place. This is the moment of the hypothetical birth of the mental life. In the Freudian theory, the id can be compared to a huge cauldron containing unconscious material and seething excitations. As we saw in the previous video, one end of it opens up to somatic influences, while the other, through a series of processes that will be described later, transforms into the ego, which becomes a differentiated psychic agency. Another part of the id, which Freud called the non-repressed unconscious, is formed by the sedimentation of experiences from past generations. It is, so to speak, a hoard of unconscious fantasies belonging to an archaic heritage of our species rather than our individual experiences. These fantasies, called by Freud primal scenes, include the fantasy of castration executed by the tyrannical father of the horde, that of seduction, and the scene of intercourse between parents. In contrast with these fantasies, the early repressed individual experiences contribute to the formation of the repressed unconscious. Therefore, the repressed unconscious develops on an ontogenetic base. That is to say, it develops on the base of the sedimentation of experiences which were lived by an individual during his childhood and eventually repressed. It ends up being a treasure trove of childhood memories taken from the preconscious system at the beginning. On the contrary, the non-repressed unconscious originates out of a phylogenetic base, which is the settlement of past experiences lived by mankind during previous generations. So the id stores up human history. When conscious experiences have been repeated often enough and with sufficient strength in many individuals in successive generations, they are transformed into experiences of the id and preserved by heredity. In order to understand how the psychic apparatus originates, we must start from its simplest structural elements. In both Freudian topographic models, the psychic apparatus is formed by constitutive elements, i.e. neurons that work thanks to a quantity of energy or excitation that circulates between them. This psychic energy is represented here in yellow. When a neuron or a bunch of neurons is charged with psychic energy, we classify it as being cathected. According to Freud, the word cathexis designates both the act of cathecting a single neuron or a group of neurons by charging it with psychic energy, and the amount of energy cathected, which Freud called bound energy. However, Freud always speculated about what exactly bound energy is, as he used the concept of binding and its opposites, freedom or mobility of cathexis, in over a dozen different ways. Freud used the term contact barrier to describe the neurophysiological entity subsequently known as synapse, namely a process of conduction between neurons. In order to pass from one neuron to another, the excitations must overcome this contact barrier, which resists the passage of energy. When this step implies a permanent decrease of this resistance, we can say facilitation has taken place. From then onward, the excitation will choose the facilitated path in preference to the one that has not been facilitated. The mnemic trace is a special arrangement of facilitations that make a certain preferred path between neurons. From an economic viewpoint, Freud supposed that the neuronal system had an original tendency to maintain the energetic quantity that flows within it to the lowest possible level. He thought that the unconscious system tries to decrease the energetic charge to zero, while in the preconscious and conscious systems, the energy is bound rather than freely circulating, so a complete discharge is not possible. Actually, the preconscious and conscious systems need to store an amount of energy in order to perform a specific action needed by the organism to satisfy the exigencies of life. For example, if we feel hunger, we need an amount of stored energy in order to look for food and get it. For this reason, a full discharge of energy is incompatible with life. Therefore, in the preconscious and conscious systems, the psychic apparatus is forced to abandon the so-called inertia principle, namely the original tendency to completely discharge energy down to zero, and replace it with the constancy principle. According to this second principle, the energy tends to be reduced to the lowest possible level, but never to zero. The inertia principle regulates the primary type of operation of the apparatus, namely the free flow of energy as it occurs in the unconscious system. Freud called this free circulation of quantities of neuronal excitation primary process. The constancy principle corresponds to the secondary process, in which the psychic energy is bound and maintained at a certain level rather than being discharged to zero. As we can see, we come to the formulation of two modes of functioning of the psychic apparatus. The first mode is regulated by the inertia principle and discharges the tension that flows within the system. The second mode is regulated by the constancy principle on the basis of the achievement of a specific objective in the external reality. Based on the fact that, generally speaking, the reduction of tension within the psychic apparatus is subjectively perceived as pleasurable, Freud defines pleasure principle as the laws that regulate the movement of energy charges within the unconscious system, and reality principle as the laws that regulate the functioning of the preconscious and conscious systems. In the Freudian psychoanalytical model, the notion of pleasure is in the foreground. The psychic apparatus is set in motion not in order to reach an object that allows the satisfaction of vital exigencies, such as hunger, but to reach the realization of an unconscious wish. In other words, drives primarily seek pleasure, namely a full discharge. They do not seek primarily an object. For the same reason, by equating sexuality and pleasure, we can state that sexual impulses, rather than the preservation instincts, are in the foreground of Freud's theory. Let's take the origin of the psychic apparatus back one step. At the very beginning, even before the apparatus can function by processing the stimuli, a foundational act takes place. It is a fundamental mechanism which institutes the psychic apparatus itself and is necessary to prevent it being flooded by the quantity of internal or external stimuli, which would result in a traumatic situation. As Freud illustrates in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, this primal defense is previous to the establishment of the pleasure principle in the psychic apparatus. The organism protects itself against excitations coming from the outside world through a physiological barrier, which Freud called the protective shield. He imagined it as a superficial layer, a sort of barrier that surrounds the organism and passively filters the external excitations. Through this function, the protective shield allows only a small amount of external energy to access the mental apparatus. Without this shield, the organism would be in danger of being destroyed by the overwhelming intensity of the stimuli. We can imagine the primal defense as the internal equivalent of the external protective shield. In other words, the function of this primal defense is to suppress over-arousal for the mental apparatus, which is caused by the excessive intensity of the archaic experiences or stimuli. It has the function of linking the amount of stimuli that enters the mental apparatus in order to avoid traumatism. It also gives the stimuli a meaning, and by doing so, it allows the beginning of the regime of the pleasure principle and the primary process. It is possible to graphically represent this first primal defense between the id and the body on the surface of the apparatus in relation to the reception of external or internal stimuli. This mechanism attributes meaning to the incoming stimuli by relating them to objects, thus establishing experiences of satisfaction or pain. It limits the free flow of excitations by the first level of binding. This is what Freud called primary process. Breastfeeding is a good illustration of how primal defense works, in that it is a classic example of satisfactory experience. After this experience occurs, the mnemic image of the breast remains associated with the mnemic trace of the excitement resulting from hunger. As it has been said, the incoming inner stimuli is linked to the external object, in this case the breast. When this need is presented again, the mnemic image of the breast's perception is reloaded and the situation of the first satisfaction is re-established by this hallucination. From that moment onward, the unconscious drives, precisely because they pursue pleasure rather than an object, find their hallucinatory discharge according to the pleasure principle. So, by attributing meaning to the incoming stimuli, the primal defense establishes the passage from quantity to quality. That is to say, from the quantity of energy to the quality of feelings, such as pleasure, satisfaction, or pain. It also fixates the object's perception to the mnemic trace. We will see in the next video how the psychic apparatus continues to organize following the establishment of the primal defense.